My name is Cade Cooper. I'm a Utah boy who was raised in a small town in southern Utah until I was 18 years old. I spent a couple years in Hawaii, and I spent most of my adult life and my married life in the southern United States and a little bit in the Midwest. In the last 5 years, I've been back here in Utah. I'm a single father to a 12-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old boy. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes referred to as the Mormon Church. I'm a grateful recovering addict to a crippling drug and pornography addiction, and I've been clean for over 3 years now. I'm a small business owner, and most importantly, I'm a child of the eternal God, and so are you. I have a few reasons for doing what I'm doing. This last few years, my state, my culture, my church, the world has been hit with some catastrophic events, and through my life and through a lot of training and therapy and different things, I've been able to recognize where a lot of people struggle. And my goal is to try and share my life in a very vivid, unfiltered, raw way, which may not always make me look great at certain times, but my hope is that even if you don't agree with my perspectives or my journey, you may be able to draw parallels that might help you with yours. And part of this is to bring other people on that are going to share incredible stories of human triumph. In the end, to show you how I went from a man who was hopelessly addicted to drugs, who woke up in the morning and anxiety filled my body so much I felt like I couldn't get out of bed, who at a certain point thought the world would be better without me, who was so upset at God if there was a God because I felt forsaken that I wanted no part of him, who had an incredibly hard time dealing with relationships, who had a crippling fear of rejection, who was so codependent and tried to keep other people happy at the expense of my happiness, to someone who loves himself, to someone who wants you to like me but does not care if you do, to someone that doesn't require other people to think and act like I do in order to like them. I do not need to compromise my convictions to be compassionate. If my story and my truth offends you, frankly, I don't care. But I can certainly understand why it would be. I am very polarizing and I can be divisive. But who I am and what I believe and what I'll say is what I believe will help people. And if it upsets you, I understand. But I would probably ask yourself why you're allowing yourself to be upset by someone that you don't know. As I was coming to think what I was going to do, I run a small pest control business, and I probably spent $250,000 on me personally through health to heal certain things in my body I'll talk about, a ton on therapy, a ton on multiple drug rehabs. And through this, I've come to learn a lot. And at my core, I help people process their trauma. And I help them go through trauma and prevent them from going through trauma that they don't need to go through. And I do that using my trauma through the atonement of my Savior, Jesus Christ. As these gifts started to come about, I thought, well, maybe God didn't give me all this to just kill bugs every day. Because it's not that fulfilling anymore. Actually, it wasn't really. But it made good money. So as I started to really heal, I thought about life coaching, and honestly, I took some of the courses, and for me, it wasn't, nothing against it, it just wasn't for me, right? And I also like to help people get deep down within their behavior. I'm a firm believer that in order to really change, you need to process your past. And quick fixes that I've seen have temporary results. I believe in going back with someone who is trained and good and therapeutic, and to be able to help you reframe this past experience so it doesn't continue to hold you back. So I started to think about becoming a licensed therapist, and to be honest, I'm know a ton about therapy, and I'm better than any of the therapists with the exception of one that's still my therapist that I've ever talked to. And then I started doing intervention work, and it was very interesting, and I like that type of work. And I've gotten to where when conflict would arise, it was fight or flight. I was always fight, and sometimes flight. But through intervention work and through dealing with conflict all the time, I started to be able to calm down when situations would escalate. Conflict is inevitable, contention is optional. But I see a lot of people shooting to contention. And I see a lot of people that are so afraid of conflict that they avoid it at all costs until they blow up. My friend Clint Olson, who is the executive producer to this, called me a few months ago, and he said, Cade, maybe you should do a podcast. And it felt different, and I've had the idea pitched to me before, but it felt right. And it's kind of evolved, and I put a lot of time into this. I put a lot of money into it, because in the end I want to help people. It's an interesting thing with addictions, with drugs, with all these things. You build a tolerance to them. We build a tolerance to everything. We're in a world of high accessibility to instant stimuli. And it's creating all sorts of problems. And, it's all progressive. The brain, in order to get the same type of high or distraction or whatever you want, needs more and more of it. But I've learned something about God's work, and I've learned something about helping people. I never get a tolerance to it. Through the grace of God, I've been able to help many, many people. And when you hear someone say how much you've helped them, that doesn't produce ego. It produces humility. And it helps me remember what God has done for me in my life. And, I try to separate myself with this project from my own ambitions. And, I've come away with two understood truths. And the first is Satan does not want me to do what I'm doing. Christ had two great commandments. And it's interesting when people ask him, or they ask, what are the two great commandments for you that are in Christianity? The first, they'll say, well, love God and love your neighbor. Well, there's another part to the second one, is love your neighbor as yourself. It is a commandment for us to love ourselves. And through this process, I'll talk about that. But Satan also has two great commandments. To be ashamed and run and hide. Shame is not of God. And one of my main goals here is to destigmatize the negative connotations associated with shame. Guilt is I feel bad, I did something. Shame is I've done something, there's something wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with us. We're human beings that are largely shaped by a lot of influences which are out of our control, and then by choices that we've made, good and bad. But I used to think there was something wrong with me, but there certainly isn't. So I'm going to share my story with you today, really to the world. And I've shared this story quite a bit. I've shared it in public. I've shared it in large settings. And I like to speak. I like the sound of my own voice, maybe a little too much. But I feel a little inadequate. And that's probably a good thing. And my prayer to God is that I will be able to convey to you how real God is and what He's done in my life. The story is very raw. It's very vivid. I would share everything 100%, but I have to omit certain details to protect certain people I care about. So I start off with a disclaimer that everyone in my life, whether they've created good or bad things for me, I've been very lucky because they're all pretty dang good people. So I don't have any resentment. So I don't have any regrets. Everything that happened has brought me to a point where I finally became willing to allow God and Christ step into my life, and it's created a man that I love today. So I was raised in this small town in southern Utah. I was the middle of 5 boys, and a lot of addicts. And by the way, this podcast is not an addiction podcast. It's not a podcast for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, nor am I an official spokesman for that church, and my thoughts and opinions do not represent that church. They are my personal feelings, although I'll draw heavily upon it because it's part of my story. But yeah. So I was raised in southern Utah, the middle of 5 boys, to wonderful parents. And, around the age of around 7 years old, my dad had a back massager, and my older brothers, through curiosity, got a hold of it. And I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and they brought it in the room, and they didn't really know what was happening, and I didn't know what was happening, but I had used it and put it on my groin, and I experienced an orgasm. And I was too young to have any sexual thoughts. I didn't think that way, but I got heavily addicted to that at way too young of an age. An addiction usually comes with a pre-genetic disposition coupled by either too much trauma or too much stimulation at an early age, and it changed the neurotransmitters, the wiring in my brain. And from that point on, I started to have addictive behaviors. And I was addicted to it for quite a while. Eventually I had stopped using it, and then around 11, 12 years old, I got exposed to pornography, and it became a daily addiction. And there's a lot of shame associated with it, a lot of hiding, a lot of feeling unworthy. And the God I grew up believing in was always mad at me. He was always upset with me. He was ashamed. I was just waiting for the next punishment. Anytime something bad happened, I traced it back to the last time I messed up. And that's just kind of the way that I believed. And, it wasn't necessarily the narrative of my parents or my faith, but it was just kind of a cultural thing that has affected a lot of people, I think, that are raised in hyper-religious households. At 15 years old, I was heavily into sports, and I was starting to get interest in girls, and I just decided I didn't want to be a good kid anymore, whatever that meant, and I was tired of that reputation. I loved basketball, and I'd been named freshman of the year on my basketball team, but my sophomore year, I just decided I wanted to see what smoking was like. And so one night I borrowed a cigarette from a friend and went and smoked it, and all my friends that were with me ended up smoking it too. And immediately, the moment I smoked that, I was like, I'm going to get drunk and high. And a few months later, I did those two things, and a few months after that, I had a new group of friends, because out of all my friends who I stayed close with, I was the only one that needed this stuff. And when I started smoking marijuana, it just kind of cured everything. But I was always high or looking to get high all the time. And I lived in a small town where sometimes drugs would disappear for a few days and everyone would go crazy. And we would drive around and we would wait for the guy to come in from up north, and we'd hit him on his pager, and then we'd have our drugs for a few days. And I thought it was fun at the time. But as I look back, in retrospect, I really wasn't having a lot of fun, because I was in a small town. The police knew who we were all using. It was like a game of cat and mouse all the time. I caused all kinds of stress for my poor parents, who had never, either one of them, struggled with drugs or alcohol or anything of the sort. And so they didn't quite know how to deal with it. I graduated barely with a 2.0, enough that I could just play sports. But I wasn't aware, or I was aware of how much I was hurting my parents, and I wanted to go on a mission. I wanted to be one of those guys. If you guys aren't familiar with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you've certainly seen our missionaries. We stand out. We wear a shirt and a tie, and we go around and knock on doors and talk about Jesus Christ, and talk about his prophet in this dispensation, a man named Joseph Smith, and share our message. And I wanted to do that. And for me, it was kind of a way out, kind of a way to get clean. And not many people thought I would go. My dad was extremely well known in my community, and I definitely have the middle child syndrome. And I ended up going, and it was 2 years that was two of the best years of my life. And at that time, I thought I would never have stronger experiences that I had at that time with God, because it was then I truly came to know Him. And I came to understand my Savior Jesus Christ and the power that came from dedicating my life to Him and going around all day trying to share a message that had helped me so much, and seeing how much it had helped other people. And so I served a wonderful mission, 2 years with the Hawaiian people, with the Polynesian people, who are still to this day, they're part of me. There's a special connection I have, and they taught me so much about love. So I came home and I enrolled in school, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was kind of I wasn't partying again, but this addictive nature was still kicking in. So I met some friends, right, and didn't know what I was going to do for school. And, we started going clubbing, and, I was introduced to the art of freak dancing. And, there's nothing funnier than a bunch of sexually repressed Christian kids who don't party getting stuck up in a club together and just going wild with each other, trying to handle their hormones. But it was incredibly addictive, because I didn't need to talk to any of the girls. I didn't need to do anything like that. I just needed to go there, dance a bunch. And so we would go 3-4 times a week, and then we'd come home and we would go out to eat. I'd get home at 5 o'clock. I'd typically look at pornography, masturbate, and then I'd go to sleep. Well, this didn't sit very well with school. And the kind of guy I was, I didn't pull out of my classes in time, so I paid for my classes, although I never went. And then I got put on academic probation more than once, because this addictive nature was taking over my life in the form of pornography and freak dancing. So eventually I started to get out of this stuff, and I, through the grace of God, pornography was taken from me as an addictive thing right around that time. And it's never really been what I would call an addictive thing. And I'll discuss much more in detail the plague of pornography and what it is. And, the science is damning. The reality behind it is damning. But I can talk more about that later. I went and I started selling pest control, because I had experience knocking on doors. I started doing it. A lot of people of my faith do it and have made a lot of money, and I became very good at it. And I was making a ton of money in the summer, and not raised with a ton of money, so I had no idea really how to handle it. I ended up meeting a wonderful girl when we got married, and she was everything to me. And we would move quite a bit. Once I found out I was going to have my daughter. Now, I'm like I said, the middle of 5 boys, and hearing that I'm going to have a daughter, I'll never forget that feeling when the ultrasound therapist, she wrote "it's a girl" on that sign, and it was an incredible feeling. But I realized I've got to figure out some sort of career here, right? This moving back and forth isn't going to be good for a family. And so I'd sold for a wonderful company in Dallas, Texas, and at this point I'd lived in a bunch of states, and we kind of came up with an agreement where me and my best friend we would staff an office and run it, and they would finance it, and we'd split it in 4, and we'd get our ownership through sweat equity. All the salesmen that I had coming around to sell for me, they were all friends of my little brother. I knew their families, I knew everyone. Well, the problem was, at that point, I still thought you could make people happy. And I also thought it was, as their employer, and just in general, it was my job in life to make people happy, which is impossible, because happiness is a choice. Well, when you have 20-year-olds that are knocking doors, and it's pure commission, it's very rare that everyone has a good day the same day. Very rare. And at the end of the day, my day was only as good as the worst day of that sales rep. And I lost, I lost focus of what was important. My poor wife went from a guy who was incredibly in love with her to a guy who still was, but a guy who was so nervous about the aspect of raising a daughter and nervous about these guys, having a good summer and this business succeeding, that I spent all my days working on this thing all the time. And it started to create an incredible amount of stress in my life. About 3/4 of the way through this summer, this was in 2010, and I was, I think, 29 years old at the time, I got a call from back home that my dad was really sick. He was working out in Page, Arizona, and they said they needed to lifeline him. My dad was the best person I've ever known. And as I've grown older, I've often wished he would be able to meet me as I am now. But the shock of hearing that I might potentially lose my hero was too much for me to handle. And for the first time, I thought maybe drugs are okay. And honestly, really it was to deal with the physical stress that it was creating in my stomach. So I went to a doctor and she prescribed me Xanax. I didn't know how Xanax works, but I sure love the idea. This is a legal thing. I'm no longer doing illegal drugs. It's okay. And Xanax is not a drug that should be taken every day. I think being prescribed that drug every day is a terrible thing to do. But I was. And Xanax hits you immediately. It's designed to kick panic attacks. So I'm out at dinner with my sales reps, and I'm going to take this pill, and then, it'll kick in an hour, and I'm going to come home, and it kicked in 8 seconds. So it was a very interesting dinner, because I was high out of my mind, and I got to tell all these stories about the embarrassing things I did with my little brother. And one time, he didn't answer the phone. I was mad at him, so I pushed him, and he went through our wall, actually, in his towel, and his towel fell off, and my dad went out. And yeah, it's a story for another time. But at the time, I didn't feel any of that fear. I didn't feel any of that anxiety. And that addictive nature kicked in. See, my brain has started to heal from that now. But for me, I do not understand. If something feels good, why do you not want to feel more and more and more? And so I started taking more and more of this drug. And so I was going back to this doctor, and she realized, hey, this is above my education. So she sent me to a psychiatrist. Now, I didn't understand the difference between psychiatry and psychology at the time, but I expected to go and meet with someone and talk about my emotional issues and problems and kind of work through them. And then if I needed medication, then they'd give me medication. Well, this place was a drug mill. And this guy saw 20 people an hour. And you could get whatever you wanted. And sadly, that still happens today. And I went in there, and I came out with a prescription for 20 milligrams of Ambien for me to sleep, a bunch of Lexapro as an antidepressant, 3 bars or 3 2-milligram extended release of Xanax, which is a huge amount to take, and also something called Topamax. And so I left, and I started taking these drugs, and slowly they started to take me over. And it got to the point where I would go out and service calls, with my business partner, and I eventually didn't dare talk. So I'm like, I can't tell if I'm talking, or I can't tell if this is the drugs. And it was creating so many, side effects and backlashes. And, one day I was at church, and I'd heard the old prophet of our church, Thomas S. Monson, speaking, and he was talking about Satan. For those who know who he is, President Monson is usually a pretty funny, light-hearted guy. Well, he was speaking with power. And it's like he was rebuking Satan. And it empowered me. It gave me some strength that maybe I could get over this. And in our church, we have what are called bishops. They're ecclesiastical leaders through a certain area. And within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the teaching is all the same. But we break up into what we call wards based on geographical areas. And then the bishop it's a calling. He's not paid for it, but he would serve kind of like a pastor. So anyway, I called him and told him I needed to talk to him. And he said, I'm not here for a week. So I cold turkeyed the Topamax, the Lexapro, and the Ambien all at once. It was not a good decision, but I didn't know any better. And, especially with the antidepressants, cold turkey was especially rough, but it was like I would go to work and I'd be able to hold myself together all day. And then when I would come home at night, I would just lose things and I would go into crying fits. And it was extremely hard for me to deal with. And about the 7th day, finally, my bishop came back, and his name was Bishop Locke. And Bishop Locke had ALS. He was in a wheelchair, and I remember going into his office, and I didn't know him well, but that man looked so powerful to me. And my mind was not working right. And I don't remember a lot of what he said or did. I do remember I said, I'm never going to do this again, which you've heard every addict say. Today, I only say I'm not going to do it today. And that's worked out pretty well. But I remember him cautioned me on that, don't get cocky. And then he gave me what's called a priesthood blessing. And as part of this process, he will put his hands on my head and through the power of God, say or do things as dictated by the Holy Ghost. And I don't remember what he said or did. But the moment he touched my head, I felt the Spirit of God like I never have. From the crown of my head systematically go down my head, slowly go down my shoulders, go down my waist till it enveloped my feet. And I was literally encompassed by light. I felt a lot of different feelings, emotions. I've done about every drug there is. I have never felt anything close to that power of God. So the next day, I decided, I didn't understand him again, that I was going to cold turkey Xanax. Well, I stopped taking it, and we were out with my buddy, and we had a distributor that we'd buy pesticides from, and he was taking us golfing. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was in a video game. And things were bright, and I was kind of driving around, and I felt very nervous. I started to tell my buddy, I'm like, I can't golf. He's like, you've got to. This guy's paid a lot of money. Well, our chemical rep had some experience with, drug withdrawal himself, so he was understanding. So I went home that night, and I slept pretty good. And then the next day, I went into what's called benzo withdrawal. There's only 2 drugs that can kill you from withdrawing. Heroin cannot kill you from withdrawing. You can die from overdosing, but you can't die from quitting it. You'll feel like you're dying, but you can't. Alcohol and benzos, with Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan, that family, they can kill you if you do not titrate, if you do not wean off of them. So I quit cold turkey. This drug had been blocking all this fear associated with my dad and the business for 3 months, and it came flooding into my mind. And you want to talk about terror. I didn't know what was happening, but I had this feeling that God didn't want me to take it, so I threw my medicine away. And the first night I was trying to get online, and I was trying to read how long this was going to last. Well, the problem about reading about trauma online and bad stories is people don't tend to post the good stuff. They post the crazy stuff. And what I was reading is that people's minds were broken, and that all these things would happen, and it was feeding into this fear. And then another problem with withdrawing or cold turkeying this drug is it creates nightmares, which are very vivid. And so the only little bit of sleep I would have, I'd have dreams of my family being brutally raped and murdered, and there was no getting over it. Till the second night, I started to question the reality and existence of God. And I thought I was broken forever. So the third day came, and I remember thinking the only way that I can live is if someone puts me in a padded room and does not talk to me, but just serves me food and then shuts the door. It's the only way I can go on. It's the only way that I'll agree to live. I was in such a bad state. And so I went to the grocery store, and I don't remember a lot of it, but I remember buying some orange juice, and I was sitting in the checkout line. I looked down, my hands were just covered in blood. And somehow I had broken the orange juice glass and was bleeding. At that point, I just, with what little bit of clarity I had, realized I had to go home. So I went back, and I told my wife at the time, I'm going to die if I don't get help. And I started to understand why people take their life, because the pain was so incredible I couldn't handle it. And she called the bishop, and he said, I didn't tell Cade to cold turkey that. And she ended up not throwing away that medication, but she just kind of observed like she should have. I'm grateful she did. And he said, well, you need to get back on it. And I got on it, and the moment I took to, I've never felt a contrast from such incredible pain to immediately just so much peace. But I realized I've got an incredibly strong physical addiction to a drug and medical and mental. And so I had to wean off this drug, but I realized with the amount of Xanax I was on, I should not have lived, or at the very least should have been put into multiple seizures. It's one of many times God saved my life. That power that I felt was His power protecting me, because I had a purpose in life. The next 3 years, we were building this business, and it started to go well. Within 3 years, we were doing 1.2 million in revenue, and it was just starting to become where it was profitable, and we were going to start taking dividends, and I'd put my life into it, at the expense of my family life. But I had certainly worked incredibly hard all day, every day to build this. Well, we were really excited because, we thought we were going to be able to go back with my dad soon. But during this process of time, had my brother call me, and there were some things early on that I didn't understand about the history of my church, and I was exposed to some stuff that was a little hard to understand at a very early time before most people, and it had a tremendous effect on my faith. And I went through probably 1.5 years of what I would call agnosticism. And I started questioning everything I'd ever felt. Maybe that blessing was a manufacturing of my chemistry. Drugs could do that. Maybe it was anticipation that I was feeling. Maybe all these spiritual experiences were just my mind or whatever. Maybe it wasn't. But I certainly didn't want to tell anyone what I was going through, because I didn't want to destroy anyone's faith, because there were certain things I couldn't account for. So I just kind of dealt with it.